The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. I found an old game console from my childhood in my garage, but no one else remembers its existence. When I was a small boy, I occupied myself with reading. Even as a child, by the time I was in first grade, I was reading Dante's Inferno and Stephen King's It, while many of my less mentally acute classmates were still reading picture books. Along with a lot of time spent reading, video games were growing rapidly in popularity when I was young. I remember seeing the pixelated, extremely low-resolution screen of a Warcraft 1 game, and I was amazed. It nearly hypnotized me as I watched the little blocks of men and orcs run around, chop down trees and murder each other. Classic consoles like Sega Genesis had only recently come out, along with the first primitive PC games like Doom and Diablo. I was the type of person to never throw away any books or games about anything else. I didn't give a shit. But these things were different. Books in the Middle Ages were worth more than their weight in gold. And perhaps I still had some unconscious racial memory of that dark time. I was sifting through boxes of old childhood mementos in my garage when I found the console that would cause me such trouble. The boxes were all marked Andrew's Games in my mother's flowing cursive. When she had died a few months earlier, I had gone to clean out her house and found it in the basement along with other dusty boxes. I had taken them all home to look through them later. My brother Tristan was by my side, his shaved head gleaming with sweat in the hot, stuffy garage. Sweat glistened on his upper lip as he chugged a beer, his third in the past hour. He was always a heavy drinker. Like me, Tristan was in his mid-30s and had grown up in the early video game era, playing lots of classic Nintendo, Doom and Diablo. I figured he would be a good person to have around, as he was one of the few people I knew who would actually be able to appreciate the collection. His beer belly hung low over his too tight blue jeans, jiggling as he circled the table like a shark. "You've got a lot of Sonic crap in here," Tristan said, rifling through the box and pulling out boxes of Sega Genesis games. "I always hated Sonic. Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat were way better games." "How can anyone hate Sonic? That's like hating Mario," I said as we organized and stacked games on a large wooden table. I figured it was time to sell some of this stuff, if anyone even wanted old games like these. My fingers closed around something round, about the size of a baseball. I looked down, seeing a strange console laying at the bottom corner of the box with a spherical plastic eye attached to the top. I pulled the console out, inspecting it closely. Tristan went quiet by my side. I gently laid it out on the table, recognition hitting me like a flash of lightning as I stared intently at the console. It was bright green, all fluorescent day-glow colors. At the top of it, it had a single staring eye, the dilated pupil staring out intently forwards. Thin, red vessels spiderwebbed through the plastic sclera, making the eye seem even more bloodshot and insane. Around the circumference of the eye, I saw small, plastic tentacles waving out to the side. "Holy shit," I said, excited. "It's my virtual god. I haven't thought about this thing in such a long time." Tristan looked at me oddly, staring between me and the console as if expecting a punchline. A long, low sound whispered from his open mouth. "What? That's not a real thing," he said, confused. He picked up the console, bringing it inches from his right eye and squinting down at it before flipping it over. "Is this some sort of art project or something? What the hell even is this? I never saw you have this when we were kids." "Are you kidding me?" I answered fervently, pulling out the small, green games from the box. "Look, there's games for it right here. You just slip this square cartridge into this hole." I showed him the black opening like a knife slice stretching out beneath the eye. and you hit the top of the eye to turn it on. It was so cool. I can't believe I forgot all about it. Show me, Tristan said, unconvinced. He picked up the games for the virtual god, looking through them slowly. Dead Man's Alley? Dark Presence? What the hell are those games? I've never heard of any of them. Are these all Chinese knockoffs or something? He laughed. That's probably why I've never heard of this thing. This is probably some piece of shit third world console. I gave him a half smile. Let's turn it on and see, I said, hurrying back towards the living room with the console in one hand and a couple random games in the other, the electrical cord dragging on the floor behind me like a dead snake. A pounding excitement rose in my chest. What game do you want to try first? I asked excitedly, looking at the fluorescent green cartridges in my hand. I put them out on the coffee table in front of Tristan, running behind the TV to connect the console and plug in the power cord. Well, we have Purgatory's Scream here, and he glanced down at the other game. Mass Shooter Extra Fun Time. He laughed crazily at that. As Tristan said the name of each game, the memories of playing them as a young boy came back to me, creeping out of my subconscious like childhood monsters. He handed me Purgatory's Scream, watching the console with pronounced skepticism. Good choice. You're going to love this. I remember you have to fight your way through Purgatory until you find God, I said, not wanting to ruin too much of the game for him. I turned on the TV and went over to the virtual god, putting the game cartridge in the slot. I had to twist it from side to side to get it in, just like when I was a kid. It was all coming back to me. I threw Tristan one of the controllers before turning back to the console. The white noise and static hissed on the TV expectantly. I stepped forward, raising my hand and slamming it down on the top of the eye. It immediately started glowing with a pale, ghostly light. The console shrieked and came to life beneath my hand as if I had struck a cobra. The plastic suddenly felt warm and fleshy, writhing and twitching beneath my fingers. The eye rolled wildly in its socket, flicking randomly over the room before stopping and looking straight at me. The static continued to hiss on the TV. I heard Tristan give a hoarse scream behind me. I could only stare, open-mouthed. The lidless eye never blinked. It gleamed with a fanatical luster, a deep rot of insanity shining deep down in its dilated pupil. I heard a low, mechanical voice crying out through the scream of the static. "You have chosen Purgatory's Scream," the voice said, exploding through the room in deafening blasts and rumbles. "Thank you for choosing the virtual god. Please be patient while we load your new reality." The white noise from the TV continued escalating into a shrieking cacophony, the static expanding out over everything. The dots covered the furniture, the walls and the ceiling in flickering patterns. I felt myself falling forward. I realized with horror that the tunnel had started sucking me in somehow. It curved around me like a spiraling, three-dimensional fractal of black and white dots. I tried to scream as I got pulled forward, but it strangled in my throat when I started flying into it at the speed of light. The tunnel morphed and warped around me like an acid hallucination, melting and dripping into spiraling black and white trails. A small exit at the end loomed far ahead, just a pinpoint of blackness. It came rushing up at me, widening into an abyss. I fell through it, landing hard on the ground. The air was knocked out of my lungs in a great whoosh, pain rocketing through my back. My head swam and I couldn't see anything. I blinked quickly, trying to focus. For a long moment, I had no idea where I was or what had happened. Then my memories started filtering slowly back in. "What?" I rasped, looking around. "Where the fuck am I?" I found myself laying in the middle of a dead valley. Enormous mountains covered in fine. White sands loomed overhead in every direction, their tops as sharp as scalpels. There wasn't a sign of life as far as I could see. Not a single blade of grass or a tree or insect flying through the air. The sky overhead constantly seethed with black smoke, the clouds bubbling and rippling with lightning strikes that moved from cloud to cloud every few seconds. Everything had a flat, grey sheen to it from the dim light shining through the clouds, except when the lightning illuminated the dead world in bright, strobing flashes. Tristan lay a few feet away, his eyes fluttering as he groaned, his fingers twitching and clenching. I crawled over to him, shaking him. He awoke suddenly, his dark eyes meeting mine. He sat up, his arms flailing wildly, almost striking me in the face. "Calm down," I yelled, falling backwards onto a soft sand dune. "It's just me!" He grabbed his head, shaking it slowly from side to side. "Did someone drug me or something?" Tristan whispered in a hoarse voice. No, it was that goddamn thing in the box, the virtual god. As soon as I turned it on, it sucked us in somehow. This had never happened to me as a kid while playing the virtual god. He looked like he was about to say something in response when the ground started trembling beneath us. At first, it was subtle, like the aftershocks of an earthquake, but it quickly accelerated into a cacophony of grinding stones and crashing earth. Black fissures opened up in the ground beneath my feet. The white sands disappeared down into them, as if falling into an eternal hourglass. Something in the ground roared, a primal wail that split and distorted like thunder. So loud I could feel my bones tremble with the force of it. It reminded me of a lion's roar, but it sounded electronically slowed and amplified in strange, dissonant risings and fallings. A titanic face the size of a car emerged from the abyss. Its skin looked like rough sandstone, a golden beige with fine cracks. Two enormous, lidless eyes sat on the top of its pointed head, but it had no nose, no mouth or ears. The eyes bulged from its stony body, bulging spheres as glossy as obsidian. The primal roaring that emanated from its monstrous body seemed to flow out of every part of its skin, rippling the air in powerful currents like flowing mirages. Razor-sharp, pyramidal shoulders emerged, followed by two grasping hands, each one large enough to crush me to death within its grip. Spiraling up its chest, I saw hundreds of people crucified, their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes wide and wild. Countless white shards of bone poked out through the beast's skin, as long and thin as swords, penetrating through the hands and feet of each victim and keeping them locked in their positions of torment. Black veins wrapped around their legs and arms, disappearing into quarter-sized holes eaten into their skin. Fluid constantly pumped through the dark tendrils into the writhing victims. The stone skin seemed to ripple as the creature breathed through its alien body. Its massive chest expanded and contracted as lungs like forge bellows worked furiously. More and more pieces of sandy earth fell into the seemingly infinite void beneath the beast's frantic climbing. But I knew that, at this rate, it would rip its way out of the ground within seconds. I turned to run, seeing Tristan already sprinting blindly ahead up the sandy slope of the mountain. My heart pounded furiously in my chest as waves of adrenaline shook my body. At that moment, I had no rational thoughts, just the screaming primal panic telling me to get far away from this creature from hell. I zigzagged from side to side, feeling its alien eyes boring holes into my back. A heartbeat later, its heavy stone hand came smashing down only inches to the left of my body, swiping wildly at the dead earth. I felt the air whoosh past my head as if a tractor trailer had just driven past. Fingers as thick as cinder blocks closed around the dune, gripping blindly at the sand and lifting tons of it into the air in a terrifying show of blind strength. The beast gave another splitting banshee shriek, a wail of insane fury. I continued sprinting blindly up the slope, my brother slipping and sliding 10 feet ahead of me. Sometimes we scrabbled on all fours, always hearing the strange creature with its rippling skin and crucified bodies ripping apart the earth to drag itself closer to us. My instinct told me that if this hellish thing got a hold of us, it would force us against the outside of its body with all the other silently shrieking victims, impaling us on the sharp points of bone that stuck out from its chest like the spikes of an Iron Maiden. Ahead of us, I saw a break in the ascending slope, a patch of jagged blackness cutting across the soft, yellow sands. It was the height of a child, opening up like a ragged, toothless mouth before us. A small, pinched face peeked out of the darkness. A little boy. He was an emaciated wreck. His scarecrow thin body was wrapped in fraying, hole-filled clothes. He wore an ancient shirt and pair of jeans that looked like they were literally falling off his starving frame. Countless burns and scars covered every inch of his exposed skin, as if he had been tortured and beaten his entire life. The boy quickly waved me and Tristan forward, backing into the cave as he did so. His lips moved frantically, but I couldn't hear anything over the roaring of the beast. I was afraid to look back. I could feel and hear the ground shattering apart directly behind me. Tristan scrambled into the cave ahead of me, diving in head first and dragging himself forward like a panicked animal. I was only feet away, running on all fours through the slippery white sands that collapsed beneath me with every step. I thought my heart would explode if I didn't stop soon. My entire body was covered in sweat, but cold waves of adrenaline kept pushing me forward. The little boy had crawled deeper into the cave, his small, dirt-streaked face barely visible now. Tristan had disappeared into the shadows behind him. I leapt for the opening as a massive hand smashed down on the top of the cavern's opening directly above my head. Sharp splinters of rock rained down on me as I rolled through. One heavy piece cracked into the back of my ribs, forcing the air out of my lungs with a loud gasp. I screamed as pain exploded through my chest. I kept crawling forward towards the face of the boy as more rocks fell with a sound like a rushing waterfall. I must have lost consciousness, because the next thing I remember, someone was dragging me over rough rock. Pain like fire shot through my chest every time I breathed. Smaller cuts and agonies covered the rest of my body. I swore, my head swimming with a horrible splitting migraine. Ahead of me, Tristan turned around to face me, shining his cell phone's flashlight back at my face. I felt warm trickles of blood running down my forehead and back. "Where are we?" I gasped, looking around at the claustrophobic granite tunnel that closed in around us like a coffin. Tristan had to crawl forwards bent over, his back hunched. The little boy standing in front of him had no issue. However, "These are the tunnels to the Badlands," the little boy said, his scarred face a stoic, unreadable mask. "All the caverns here seem to connect there. Some of the other kids say there are even tunnels that lead to heaven and hell, but I've never seen them myself. I'm very careful where I go. If I see fire at the bottom of a tunnel, I turn around." "Smart kid. I don't know how you've lived this long." "Kid." I turned to my brother. "Tristan, we're trapped in the game," I said, wincing as I touched my side. I had definitely cracked a couple ribs. "We've got to beat it and get the hell out before we die here. I have a feeling that if we die here, we die for real. These broken ribs definitely feel real enough." "I thought it was something insane like that," Tristan responded, shaking his head disbelievingly. "In reality, I figure I'm probably in a coma somewhere hallucinating this whole thing. But sure, I'll play along. How do we beat the game?" "From what I remember, we have to somehow make our way through purgatory and find God," I answered, knowing how insane it sounded. The little boy shook his head furiously. I crawled to my feet, having to bend down like Tristan in the confined tunnel. Together, we started slowly creeping forward, using Tristan's phone to light the way. I wondered how the boy had passed through these tunnels in the dark. "You don't want to go back out into purgatory," the boy answered. "If the creepers catch you, you will end up crucified on their bodies forever. They keep you alive with their black creepers that eat their way into your body and give you water and food. They want to make sure you stay alive for the torture." "The creepers?" I asked. "Is that what you call them?" The boy nodded, his face going pale. "They're horrible," he said. "They've taken most of my friends. Everyone I first knew when I got here is stuck on one of their bodies. They can hear through their skin. If you walk on the dunes, they will hear you and crawl out of the abyss to get you." "Kid, what's your name?" Tristan asked, taking a step closer to the boy. He put a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy instinctively flinched, drawing away. "Gage," he said, still keeping a safe distance between us and him. He seemed flitty and uncertain, probably a result of the nightmarish and horrifying things he had seen here in purgatory. "Gage Bright." "Where do these tunnels lead?" "Then, away from the creepers?" I asked. Gage frowned, looking even more nervous now. "I told you, to the Badlands. They have food and drinks there sometimes. I found a whole vending machine a few days ago, full of beef jerky and candy and soda. But there's things there, too. They're not as bad as the creepers. I don't think anything is as bad as the creepers, except maybe hell." As we talked and moved forward, I realized there was a strange, fiery light flickering from below us. The tunnel had started to descend rapidly, the smooth granite feeling slippery and smooth beneath my sneakers. "Be quiet now," Gage whispered urgently, his pale blue eyes widening as he stared intently down at the strobing radiance filling the tunnel. "We're at the border of realities, and sometimes things creep out from the void and slip through the cracks." At the bottom of the steep tunnel, the cave started to morph and change. The stone looked like it slowly melted into pale yellow wallpaper. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly, turned up to a whining drone like a drill in my brain. There was a filthy grey carpet covering the floors, glimmering wetly. Drops of sickly brown liquid were spattered over the top of it. A smell like pneumonia blew up from the hall. At the border of the cavern and the hallway, there were deep, black cracks spiderwebbing through where the melted wood and frozen drippings of hard granite met. As Gage led us past them, I peered into the darkness outside. It looked like I was staring into an abyss, an infinite void as cold and empty as outer space. I thought I caught a flash of something pale and worm-like at the far edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, it was just more empty space. I looked forward, seeing Gage rapidly waving me forward, his face a frozen, pale mask of terror. He shook his head silently from side to side, his icy eyes never dropping from mine. He stared intently at me, the intelligence and fear reflected in his expression, making him look like a much older boy. Tristan was peering into the countless rooms that covered each side of the hallway. I quickly walked forward, making as little noise as I could. "Gage," I whispered when we had gotten far away from those cracks, "do you know where God is?" Gage looked over at me nervously, shaking his head, pointing forward. I glanced around at the rooms surrounding us, seeing them filled with upside-down stop signs, blinking traffic lights and other random objects. Some of them were totally empty, just filled with the piss-colored wallpaper and wet carpets. The next one had a dead, mummified body hanging from the ceiling. Its skin was so desiccated and papery that I couldn't even tell if it had been a man or a woman. Gage seemed totally unaffected by this, glancing over with disinterest. I noticed other doors lead into their own straight, seemingly never-ending halls that disappeared in a pinpoint far off in the distance. I wondered just how big this place really was. Suddenly, Gage stopped, motioning me and Tristan near to him. "You guys are really looking to talk to God?" Gage whispered. I noticed that the far end of the hallway slowly morphed back into dark granite tunnels, the wood and stone mixing in unnatural chaotic drippings and patterns. I nodded excitedly, talking louder than I meant to. Gage instantly winced. "We need to see God as soon as possible," I said, "preferably before we die." Tristan added cynically, "God is at the top of the border of purgatory and heaven," Gage whispered, giving me a dirty look. "Keep your voice down before something notices us." He pointed at the end of the hall. I saw that here, the stone caverns ascended instead of descending. "If you follow the path back up, you'll come out at the top of purgatory near the god's silver spire. But the place is swarming with creepers. I never got to hear the last of his thought. I heard a cracking like bones behind us. I jumped, spinning around to see the hallway tearing itself apart down the middle. The walls split apart, splintering and falling into a seemingly eternal abyss that lay all around it. Something alien twisted and spun there, a horror from between worlds. It reminded me of a massive hellish worm, something that had evolved in some dark black hole world where sinister and powerful monsters skittered under the surface. Circular ridges like those of an earthworm covered the length of its body. Its skin was pale and wet-looking, the color of writhing maggots. It was nearly as wide as the hallway itself, its body as long as a tunnel. The worm gave a soft hissing sound. Two milky cataract eyes stared out from each side of its head, flat and lacking any pupils or iris that I could see. Its lips were tightly pressed together, looking like no more than a pale, white scar healed across its monstrous face. Hundreds of hollow, translucent fangs curved outwards over it, overlapping and dripping with frothy saliva. Each looked large enough to impale a full-grown man. "The worm! Go up!" Gage screamed. "Don't let it take you." My cracked ribs shrieked with fresh waves of pain as I stumbled down the hall, towards the intersection of the stone and wood where the cavern started rising in a steep slope. The floor collapsed beneath our feet, the wooden splinters exploding and clattering down into a seemingly never-ending drop. Tristan was in the lead, frantically making his way towards safety. Gage was by my side. Sharp pieces of dark granite littered the end of the hallway's floor. More and more loose pieces of the cavern fell downwards as the hallway ripped itself apart in a rhythmic, smashing cacophony, shaking the entire structure with chaotic rumbles. I felt the ground dissolving beneath my feet. Gage's eyes widened in horror next to me as the wooden boards started disassembling beneath him like pieces of a puzzle falling apart. A small foot caught one of the stones, the boy falling forward as if in slow motion. I leapt towards the stone floor only 5 feet away with all my strength, feeling the wood give a sickening lurch beneath me before disappearing. Gage screamed, his eyes widening as he fell. I scrambled down over the edge of the stone, trying to reach a hand out and grab him. But within the space of a heartbeat, he was gone, falling down into the darkness, his screams fading like the last echoes of a dying heartbeat. Tristan and I stopped a few dozen feet down the stone cavern. I bent over, catching my breath and clutching my damaged chest. I heard Tristan hyperventilating only a few feet away. "Is Gage?" he asked. I nodded grimly. "He fell," I answered sadly. The stone cavern continued to shake violently. I could hear the worm softly slithering around its edges, slamming its massive body into the walls. Tristan and I looked up at the top of the tunnel, seeing a hypnotizing, rainbow-colored effulgence spiraling down from the top. Somehow, seeing such beauty in this place of horrors gave me a sliver of renewed hope. Gage wrapped an arm around my shoulders, helping me up. I stumbled forward, every breath an agony. We came out the top of the stone tunnel, finding ourselves standing on top of a sandy mountain. We were much higher than all the surrounding ones. I could look out hundreds of miles in each direction across the dead mountains of Purgatory, seeing the white sands and pointed peaks disappearing off in the distance. On top of the mountain we found ourselves on, I beheld a beautiful spire, soaring thousands of feet into the air. The top of it disappeared into the roiling clouds overhead. The beauty of the tower was breathtaking, its architecture graceful and otherworldly. Strands of fresh, polished silver spiraled up around its outside like the steps of a lighthouse. The tower grew thinner as it ascended, until the very top looked like no more than an enormous silver railroad spike stabbing up into the black clouds. "We need to find the door," I whispered at Tristan as we crept closer to the silver spire. It was only a few hundred feet away. As we drew closer, the size of the tower truly hit home, its top disappearing miles above my head. We hadn't made it far when the first soft rumbling started underneath our feet. Tristan gave me a look of absolute horror as fissures opened up all around us. I knew it was a creeper. A single moment later, a monstrous stone face appeared. Enormous arms dragged the abomination up and out of the splitting dunes. Tristan and I ran blindly toward the silver spire, the burning pain in my ribs temporarily forgotten in the rush of adrenaline and primal terror. An enormous hand came down, smashing hard into the ground feet in front of me. The powerful stone fingers swiped at the dunes around Tristan. He gave a cry like a little boy as they closed around his chest, lifting him into the air. The primal roaring of the creeper continued growing, the insane anger and bloodlust filling every note with their dark presence. I saw 2 long, pointed castle doors at the other side of the silver spire. These looked like they had been fashioned from solid gold. On the front of each, there were engraved pictures of strange creatures with 4 faces, one facing in each direction. They each had the faces of a lion, an eagle, an ox and a man, their bodies cloaked in armor. "Help me, Andrew!" Tristan pleaded, his voice growing distant as the creeper dragged him away. I felt sick and weak imagining my brother being tortured and crucified for all eternity on that hellish beast's body. Turning, I started jumping up and down, screaming at the creeper, its head ratcheted towards me, its bulbous, black eyes shining with an inhuman luster. With its other hand, it struck out blindly at me, but its fingers smashed into the silver spire above my head. The tower rung with a sound like a struck gong, a vibrating cacophony that rose in waves up and down its length. The creeper continued moving Tristan closer to its chest, I saw a clear spot there reserved just for him. As I watched, sharp points of bone suddenly poked out through its skin, setting the spot for Tristan's unending nightmare. I heard a hissing from behind me, a sound that sent both waves of dread and a small, simmering hope racing through my chest. I turned, seeing the worm emerging from the sands laying in front of the exit of the cavern, its pale, maggot-like head twisting up. The creeper roared at it. Tristan held frozen in place in its hand still, his lips frantically moving but no sounds coming out. The creeper and the worm stared at each other across a no-man's land of whipping dunes and blowing sands, neither moving. They might have both been statues at that moment. Without warning, they ran at each other, Tristan now completely forgotten. The creeper took his fist with Tristan still inside and struck out at the worm. I saw Tristan's body go flying in the chaos of the battle, soaring through the air in a graceful arc. Spatters of bright blood followed him through the air. A moment later, Tristan landed in front of me, gasping and bleeding. I ran over to him, my breath catching in my throat. His entire left arm was gone, ripped off. Bright red arterial blood spurted from the ragged stump, staining the beige sands a deep scarlet. His eyes met mine, fluttering and roaming the black, hellish skies overhead with ineffable pain and fear. I tried dragging him towards the door to the silver spire, but the tail of the worm had begun whipping wildly, missing us by inches. I was forced to drop him and sprint blindly for cover. Heading in the direction of the golden door, I heard a primal screaming. Seeing the creeper had grabbed the worm in its hands, twisting its body in its powerful hands. It threw the worm against the sands, the crashing sound booming across the world. As the worm lay limply twitching, the creeper slunk forward, ready to finish off its opponent, but the worm came to life. Lunging towards the creeper, it pushed itself off the ground with its tail, uncoiling and flying across the air, its gnashing teeth aimed for the creeper's stone head and bulging black eyes. It bit hard into the right side of the creeper's face, sending thick, oily blood exploding from the wound. The creeper's right eye exploded like a water balloon filled with sludge. The creeper screamed, grabbing the worm by its tail and pulling. It yanked the worm off along with a large chunk of its own face, whipping it against the ground again. The worm lay stunned for a second, which was all the creeper needed. The creeper put his two massive stone fists together, bringing them down on the back of the worm's pale head. There was an explosion like a plane crash as they connected, the worm's black brains exploding through the top of its body in a thick jet of gore. I ran through the silver door into the tower. Stairs made of fine threads of silver and gold spun around upwards, seemingly forever. I crept up the steps slowly, my breath coming in painful hitches. After hours of this, I found myself at the top of the tower. It had continuously narrowed as I ascended, until it was no larger than a tomb. A silver door stood before me with a single eye engraved on it. Bracing myself for what lay behind, I flung it open. God stood before me, his skin as white and smooth as marble and eyes as black as smoke. He towered over me, his body softly radiating a rainbow of light that shimmered and rippled around him like a mystical aura. And yet, that face seemed oddly familiar. I stared through the layers of unfolding energy at God, realizing I saw my own face reflected there. "Why do you look like me?" I asked, confused and scared. God's eyes never blinked. They bored through me like lasers. It felt as if they were staring into my soul, as if everything was ripped open, laid out and revealed here in this tower of silver and gold. "I am you," he spoke in a voice like thunder. "After death, your consciousness continues evolving until it becomes me. All beings have their own God, their own future self that sits at the top of the silver spire. In many trillions of years, you will become a god in your own right." I had no idea what to say to that. "If you're so powerful, can you bring Tristan and Gage back? They didn't deserve to die, after all," I said. God's white, marble lips seemed to split into a faint smile at that. "It is dangerous to say what anyone deserves. Does the sheep deserve slaughter? Do the birds caught in hurricanes deserve to have their bodies whipped against concrete until they're just blood and feathers? In the chaos of the universe, there is no mercy. And yet, actions have consequences. Gage and Tristan have already been judged and sent forward to continue their own path, their own evolution to the divine, and you must continue yours." The last words faded out into white noise and static. Black and white dots started crawling their way down God's marble white skin, over his smooth, flawless flesh. They continued expanding out into a tunnel, and yet again, I felt myself drawn forward. I found myself standing in front of the TV in my living room, the virtual god still plugged in. The eye glowed with a soft white radiance as I looked around. On the sofa behind me lay Tristan's body, crushed and broken. Missing an arm, his sightless eyes stared blankly up, his face eternally frozen in a death mask of mortal terror. And in his remaining broken, bloody hand, I saw he was still tightly gripping the controller for the virtual god. Story 2. I took a high-paying job pressing a single button. Hi everyone. I've decided to share my story here because I don't know where else to turn. The events I will describe have been haunting my life, and I'm at a loss for what to do next. But I was desperate and bills were piling up, and my savings were almost depleted. As a single parent to a 7-year-old, finding a steady job that pays well and allows me to be home for my child was a challenge. The weight of financial hardship had become a constant companion, whispering doubts and fears into my ear. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, worrying about how I would keep a roof over our heads. Then one late night, as I was scrolling through Indeed, a job listing caught my eye. Easy job. Just press a button when the person on camera falls asleep. High pay, immediate start. The pay was astronomical for such a low-effort task. It seemed too good to be true, but at that moment, I was willing to consider anything. After a moment's hesitation, I clicked apply and filled out the application form, hoping for the best but expecting nothing. To my surprise, I received an email within minutes. The company, named Meganave Solutions, wanted to schedule an interview the next day. They provided an address and a time. The email was brief and formal, but the speed of their response added to my growing sense of unease. Despite my reservations, I decided to go. The promise of upfront payment was too tempting to pass up. The next morning, I dropped my daughter off at school and headed to the address provided. It was a small, nondescript office building sandwiched between a pawn shop and a vacant lot. The entrance was unremarkable, and the interior was just as bland. The receptionist, a pale woman with a vacant smile, directed me to a small interview room. A man in a suit greeted me, introducing himself as Mr. Gray. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, which did nothing to ease my nerves. He explained the job. I would be monitoring a live camera feed of a person sleeping. My only task was to press a button the moment the person fell asleep. The job paid $2,000 per night, and I would be paid after each shift. "Why is the pay so high?" I asked, unable to hide my suspicion. "Let's just say we value accuracy and discretion, Mr. Gray replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I started that night. The office where I was to work was in the same building, down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should. The room itself was small, dimly lit, with a single chair facing a large monitor. On the screen was a live feed of a bedroom. The camera was fixed, showing a bed, a nightstand, and a person lying under the covers. The person, a middle-aged man, was already in bed, his eyes closed. Next to the monitor was a single button. I sat down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me. The man on the screen remained motionless, and the room around me was silent, save for the faint hum of the monitor. Hours passed, and my nerves began to fray. I found myself leaning closer to the screen, scrutinizing every detail. The man occasionally shifted, but never opened his eyes. Each movement made my heart race, my finger hovering over the button. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's breathing slowed, and his body relaxed completely. It was the signal I had been waiting for. With a trembling hand, I pressed the button. Nothing happened, no sound, no indication that my action had been acknowledged. I sat back, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The clock on the wall showed that my shift was over. I gathered my things, leaving the strange office with a sense of relief. The next day, I received my payment as promised. The money was real, tangible proof that the job, strange as it was legitimate. I tried to put the oddness of the experience out of my mind. But that night, I returned to the office for my second shift. As I settled into the chair, I noticed something peculiar. The man on the screen was in the same position as the night before, wearing the same clothes, with the same serene expression on his face. A chill ran down my spine. I brushed it off as a coincidence, convincing myself that it was normal for someone to have similar nightly routines. Hours ticked by, and the unsettling feeling grew. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence becoming oppressive. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure standing at the foot of the man's bed. The image was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my sanity. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the feed? I didn't know, but my heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I pressed the button when the man finally fell asleep, my hand shaking more than before. Over the next few shifts, the oddities continued. I started receiving cryptic messages from my employer, instructions that seemed nonsensical, but carried an undertone of urgency. "Do not look away from the screen," one message read. "Keep your focus," said another. The man on the screen remained unchanged, but the shadows around him seemed to move of their own accord. My sleep was plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams. In one, the man on the screen was staring directly at me, his eyes empty and lifeless. In another, I was in his room, unable to move as the shadowy figure loomed closer. I woke up each time drenched in sweat, the details of the dreams etched into my mind. One night, I decided to look into the company, Meganave Solutions. There was almost no information available, no website, no reviews, nothing. It was as if the company didn't exist outside of the job listing. My unease grew, but the money was too good to walk away from. I had to endure it, at least until I could find something else. The sense of dread continued to build, and the line between reality and my dreams began to blur. The cryptic messages, the eerie stillness of the man on the screen, and the shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, all of it was driving me to the edge. Each night, I questioned my sanity a little more, wondering if I was caught in some elaborate nightmare. But as the financial burden eased, I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that I was part of something far more sinister than I had initially believed, and that realization was terrifying. Night after night, I returned to that dimly lit office, each shift dragging me deeper into a state of unease. The man on the screen remained a constant, an unmoving figure whose serene expression belied the growing horror I felt. It wasn't just the repetitiveness that unnerved me, it was the sense that I was being watched, that something or someone was aware of my every move. The cryptic messages from my employer continued, becoming more frequent and more disturbing. "Stay focused," one message read. "Do not turn around," said another. These messages would pop up randomly on my screen, making me jump every time. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to keep me on edge, to keep me scared. One night, as I sat in the small, claustrophobic room, the silence was broken by a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of my frayed nerves, but as the tapping grew louder and more insistent, I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the office. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was nothing out of place. The screen flickered again, and this time, the shadowy figure at the foot of the man's bed lingered longer. It was darker than the shadows around it, its form vaguely humanoid but indistinct. I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure seemed to turn its head, almost as if it were looking directly at me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. My nights were no longer just about pressing a button when the man fell asleep. They had become a test of endurance, a battle against the creeping paranoia that threatened to overwhelm me. I began to notice other oddities. The room seemed to grow colder as the night wore on, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispering voices, too faint to make out but always present, like a constant murmur in the back of my mind. One night, while I was on my way to the office, I ran into a man who claimed to have worked for Meganave Solutions. He was disheveled, his eyes wild and filled with fear. He grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "Leave while you still can. They're watching us. They're always watching." Before I could ask him any questions, he hurried away, leaving me standing in the street, more confused and terrified than ever. I tried to find out more about Meganave Solutions, but every attempt led to dead ends. It was as if the company was a ghost, existing only in shadows and whispers. The cryptic messages I received began to include instructions that made no sense. "When you see it, stay still, and the shadows know your name." Each message seemed designed to heighten my paranoia, to push me closer to the brink. One evening, Mr. Gray contacted me with a new task. He wanted me to monitor the feed overnight. The pay for this task was double the usual amount, but it came with strict instructions. Do not leave the room. Do not look away from the screen. Press the button as soon as he falls asleep. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, my anxiety already at a fever pitch. The room felt different, more oppressive, as if the very air was thick with foreboding. I sat down and focused on the screen, determined to see the night through. As the hours passed, the strange occurrences intensified. The shadowy figure appeared more frequently, its form becoming clearer each time. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. Around midnight, the power flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone to use its light. When the power returned, the screen showed the man on the bed sitting up, his eyes wide open and staring directly at the camera. It was the first time I had seen him move, and it filled me with a deep sense of dread. I pressed the button instinctively, but nothing happened. The man continued to stare, his eyes unblinking and filled with a silent plea. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away, unable to do anything but watch. The shadowy figure reappeared, standing behind the man, its long arms reaching out as if to envelop him. The screen flickered again, and the image was replaced with a message, "Do not look away." I was trembling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure moved closer to the man, its form becoming more defined, more terrifying. It leaned down, and the man's mouth opened in a silent scream. I couldn't take it anymore. I tore my eyes away from the screen, breaking the one rule I'd been given. The room around me seemed to come alive, the shadows deepening, and the whispering voices growing louder. I felt something cold and intangible brush against my skin, and I realized that whatever was on the screen was now in the room with me. I couldn't breathe. The cold presence in the room was palpable, wrapping around me like a vice. I clung to the hope that I was imagining it, that this was some elaborate trick my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening was real. The screen flickered again, and the message, "Do not look away," was replaced by, "Stay still." I forced myself to remain motionless, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The whispering voices seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the shadows danced around the edges of my vision. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, mingling with the eerie whispers. I tried to focus on the screen, but my eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, where the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The man on the screen had returned to his lying position, his eyes now closed, his body once again at peace. The shadowy figure had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, my body rigid, my mind racing. Eventually, the whispers faded, and the room grew still. I exhaled a shaky breath, my muscles aching from the tension. The clock on the wall showed that my shift was nearly over. With great effort, I forced myself to stand and leave the office. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every whisper of wind sounded like the hushed voices from the night before. My daughter noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I forced a smile and assured her that everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. That night, I returned to the office, dreading what awaited me. The instructions were the same: monitor the feed, press the button when the man fell asleep, and most importantly, do not look away. As I sat down and the screen flickered to life, I braced myself for the horrors to come. The man on the screen seemed agitated, his movements more restless than before. The shadowy figure appeared almost immediately, its presence now a familiar source of dread. This time, the figure didn't just stand at the foot of the bed. It moved closer, its spindly arms reaching out towards the man. I pressed the button, hoping to end the nightmare, but the man didn't fall asleep. Instead, he sat up and turned to face the camera, his eyes wide and filled with terror. "Help me," he mouthed, his voice silent but desperate. My heart raced as I watched. Unable to tear my eyes away, the shadowy figure loomed over the man, its form growing darker, more menacing. The screen flickered, and a new message appeared: "Do not speak." The figure's arms enveloped the man, and for a moment, it seemed to merge with him, its darkness seeping into his very being. The man's face twisted in agony, his silent screams echoing in my mind. I wanted to scream too, but the command on the screen kept me silent. As the figure merged completely with the man, the shadows in the room around me grew thicker, more oppressive. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. They spoke my name, repeating it over and over, a sinister chant that filled me with dread. Suddenly, the screen went black, and the room was plunged into darkness. I could feel the presence of the shadowy figure, its cold, intangible touch brushing against my skin. I fought the urge to run, to scream, to do anything that might break the spell. The screen flickered back to life, showing the man lying peacefully once more. The message "Do not move" appeared, and I obeyed, too terrified to do otherwise. The figure had vanished, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. As the night dragged on, the figure reappeared several times, each time more menacing than the last. It no longer stayed confined to the screen. It seemed to bleed into my reality, the boundaries between the two worlds blurring. My fear reached a fever pitch, every moment a struggle to maintain my sanity. I began to notice changes in my surroundings. Objects in the room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, subtle but undeniable. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a constant background noise, like a sinister lullaby that never ceased. The final hours of my shift were a waking nightmare. I could feel the figure's presence growing stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of the room. The man on the screen seemed to mirror my own terror, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body tense and rigid. When the clock finally signaled the end of my shift, I fled the office, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I knew that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the office. It had followed me home, invading my life and my mind. The decision to leave the job was not an easy one, but after that final night, I knew I couldn't continue. The terror I felt wasn't worth any amount of money. I called Mr. Gray the next morning, my voice shaking as I told him I was quitting. He didn't seem surprised or upset. He simply said, "We understand. Your final payment will be transferred today." There was a cold finality to his words that chilled me to the bone. I tried to return to normal life, focusing on my daughter and trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. But the experience had left a mark, a shadow that clung to my every thought. The house felt different, as if the darkness from the office had followed me home. The first sign that something was wrong came a few nights later. I woke up to find my daughter standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was the same expression the man on the screen had worn. My heart pounded in my chest as I gently called her name. She blinked, then turned and walked back to her room without a word. The next day, she began to draw strange pictures. They were crude but unsettling, screens with buttons, shadowy figures, and messages like "Don't move" and "Don't speak," scrawled in her childish handwriting. I asked her where she had seen these things, but she just shrugged and said she didn't know. The drawings became more frequent, each one more disturbing than the last. She started sleeping in the same position as the man from the screen, her body rigid and her eyes closed in a semblance of peace that was anything but restful. Some nights, I would find her staring at me from her bed, her eyes wide and filled with an unnatural awareness. My nights were filled with sleepless terror as I watched over my daughter, my mind replaying the horrors I had witnessed in that office. The whispers I had heard there seemed to follow me home, now faint but ever present, like a sinister background noise that I couldn't escape. I took her to see a doctor, but they found nothing wrong. They attributed her behavior to stress or an overactive imagination. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever darkness I had encountered in that job had latched onto my daughter, using her innocence as a conduit for its malevolence. I tried to burn the drawings, but more appeared, almost as if she were compelled to create them. Each new picture drove another nail into the coffin of my sanity, the images haunting my every waking moment. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by an unseen force that I couldn't fight. One night, as I was tucking her in, she looked at me with those same wide, unblinking eyes and said, "They're watching us. Mommy, they're always watching." The words sent a chill down my spine, the same phrase the man in the street had told me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with fear and helplessness. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of the man on the screen, his face twisted in agony as the shadowy figure enveloped him. I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers louder than ever. In the weeks that followed, the situation only worsened. My daughter began to speak in her sleep, repeating the commands I had seen on the screen. Do not move. Do not speak. She would sit up in bed and stare at the wall, her eyes vacant and distant. I could see the shadow of the figure in her drawings, growing darker and more defined with each passing day. One morning, I found a new drawing taped to her bedroom wall. It was a perfect depiction of the room I had worked in, down to the smallest detail. In the center of the drawing was a figure, hunched over a monitor, with a dark shadow looming behind it. Below it were the words, "Don't look away." I knew then that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness that had seeped into my life wasn't something I could escape or ignore. It had taken root, and its influence was growing stronger, feeding off my fear and my daughter's innocence. As I watched her sleep, lying in that same eerie position, I felt a shiver of dread. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me with that haunting stare. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're here." The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The shadowy figure, the whispers, the commands, they weren't confined to the office. They were here, in my home, in my daughter's mind, and they weren't going to leave. Story 3. The Loser's Swing. How many of you had an imaginary friend when you were young? Do you remember why you made them? And when you finally let them go, do you know where they came from? I do. I remember. Not out of nostalgia. I remember out of regret. Regret for ever having dreamt him up. For bringing him into my life. Lonely people make poor decisions. And now I'm paying the price for it. Only, I'm not the only one. That's what pains me more than anything else. I was a latchkey kid growing up. My father served in the army overseas, and my mother took up a job at home to further support us. My mother didn't return until a good couple of hours after school let out, so I'd be alone for a good while. I was an only child and had trouble making friends, so this compounded my loneliness. There was a playground about 2 blocks from my house that I'd frequent after coming home from school. I could get there faster by cutting through a small but thick forest clearing behind my house. It depended on how I was feeling whether I'd do so, as the canopy of the tree line made the forest below dark as all get out. Some days I'd cut straight through, and some days it made me far too rattled and anxious to try. The playground itself was very old. There had been some additions to it over the years, as well as some parts getting replaced for safety reasons. However, I don't think anything short of a full power wash could get all the rust off the swing set chains and corners of the jungle gym. I overheard kids at my school talking about how creepy the place was now and then. Some even came up with their own urban legends surrounding the place. I never found it that scary, though. To me, the where was almost comforting. Whenever the playground was empty, I'd imagine all the kids who had played there. I'd imagine them in all the old outfits I saw from vintage photos in history books at school. They'd throw around old slang and lingo amongst each other, and I'd watch from the lone swing set in the corner of the playground. The loser's swing. It was called that due to being a swing set with only one swing. Over time, the second swing's attachment to the chains had degraded in an unrepairable way. So, they detached it. From what I understand, the playground had already been on the chopping block for years. The town didn't want to bother shelling out the cash to replace the whole thing. So, only one person could swing in it. Instead of being jealous or fighting over the seat, most kids who came there would make fun of whoever was using it. After all, to use the swing was to use it alone. You don't play with anyone else. You just swing by yourself. Even with that kind of baggage attached to it, it never dissuaded me from using it. I was pretty used to being by myself, so it wasn't hard to tune everyone else out. Also, I was scared of falling off the jungle gym. I'd seen it happen before, and it looked like it hurt. After a while, I made up an imaginary friend. I sort of modeled him after one of my dad's friends, because I thought he was cool. Called him Rob, an older guy in his 30s, who seemed to have an answer for everything you asked him, and a story to match. When I used the swing, I'd envision the swing next to me repairing itself, and he'd take the seat. I'd ask him why the sky was blue, and he'd say, well, 'cause it's God's favorite color. I'd ask how planes stay in the air, and he'd tell me they had people behind it blowing it forward real hard. I'd ask all the questions kids ask, and he'd always have an answer right away. Only one question seemed to stump him. I asked, why do people die? He looked at me, tilted his head, and stared for a long while. He seemed to be as confused as I was, but tried to come up with an answer. Around that time, my grandfather had passed away, and I was struggling trying to come to terms with it. I was hoping he'd share his wisdom with me once more, and put my mind at ease. Well, he said, clapping his broad hands over denim-clad knees, maybe it's just some people's time to go. Usually, he was funny and reassuring. I remember feeling upset by this answer. It was very apathetic. I was too young to understand what the word apathy meant at the time, let alone why his answer upset me. I wanted to feel like there was a reason people died. He didn't give me one. Why do they have to go? They just have to. I stopped asking as many questions after that. I'd ask him to tell me stories while we were swinging. As the days went on, though, the playground lost more of its color. The paint was peeling off more and fewer kids came to play. There were rumors that they were going to completely tear the place down any day now. It was sad for me, but the playground had become less of a comfort over time. I struggled to keep up the conversation with my imaginary friend. I couldn't even maintain the image of all those old kids playing here. It was hard imagining anyone playing here anymore. I remember the last time I went, though. I had been getting bullied in school for a while. I don't want to mention him by his real name, so I'll call him John. As far as bullying goes, it wasn't anything too awful. He'd pick on me, sure, but it was just name-calling, or teasing me for not having friends. He never tried to hit me, or anything like that, but he was relentless. One day, he heard that I'd go to the playground after school, so he decided to come visit it. I can't remember what he said when he showed up. Some generic teasing, I'm sure, making fun of me for using the loser's swing. Again, nothing out of the realm of very basic schoolyard bullying. I tuned it out the best I could and kept swinging, my gaze glued straight ahead. He got mad that I was ignoring him and grabbed the chains mid-swing to stop me. That's when Rob got up. I remember his face twisting into a terrifying, enraged expression. His face red as a beet. He pointed at John and screamed at him to get away from me, and that he'd beat him half to death if he didn't turn tail. I flinched, completely horrified by how angry he was, and wanting to shrivel into myself like a snail to hide from it. I don't know what came over him, and had never seen him act like that before. That isn't even what haunts me about it, though. It's the fact that John heard him, too. I remember the shocked expression on his face, like he couldn't believe what he heard. Taking the opportunity, I stumbled off the back of the swing and took off as fast as I could. I cut through the forest, shielding myself with my arms from all the branches and brambles. It felt like the forest stretched into forever as I ran, my heart pounding and my lungs burning. Even though I knew that I was all alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being chased, that if I didn't make it out of the woods, no one would ever find me again. After running and stumbling and picking myself up over and over, I finally saw the light from the other side. I could see my house in the distance. I swear I heard a voice calling to me from behind, telling me to wait. I ignored it and kept pushing until I was clear of the woods and safely past the fence of my backyard. I ran into my house, locked all the doors and windows, and hid in my closet for hours until I heard my mom come home. I tried my best to act like nothing had happened, but she knew something was up. She was always worried about me. I ate dinner and went to bed early, clutching the blanket to my body like a protective cover the whole night. That was the last time I ever saw John. I didn't see Rob for a long time, either. In the following days, they had put up missing posters all over the neighborhood for John. He hadn't come home, and I seemed to be the last person who ever saw him. The police visited our house and asked me some basic questions about it, since a few of his friends knew he had come to the playground for me specifically, but didn't come along with him that day. I gave them a general summary of what happened, without Rob's part in the story. I just told them he had come to the playground to bully me, and that I ran back home. They seemed to accept what I said and didn't come to question me again after that. After all, there wasn't much more I could tell them. I was just a kid. There were rumors about me after that in school. Some of the other kids spoke in hushed whispers that I killed him and hid his body in the woods. As much as it upset me at the time, I can't blame them all that much. We were kids, and I was always distant and antisocial. If I was in their shoes, I might have thought the same thing. For the rest of my school life, I did my best to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. I made a few friends here and there. Thankfully, it wasn't a lot of friends, but they were good ones. Without them, I could have turned into an insane recluse as I got older. As I mentioned, I didn't see Rob after that. I dropped the imaginary friends entirely, too traumatized by what had happened to bother humoring the idea anymore. Not to mention, I had real friends to spend time with now. I didn't need an imaginary one. Even then, I'd sometimes lay awake in my bed late at night, too terrified to look out the window. I'd envision him looking back at me from the black forest, making that same twisted expression. The fear faded over time, but it still lingered in the back of my mind now and then. Years passed, and that fear still clung to the back of my mind when life dealt me another terrible hand. Recently, my mother passed away. My father had died quite a while before that overseas, so she was all I had left in terms of family. The grief broke me. I retreated into myself after the funeral, content to live alone and not form any more connections. The idea of losing anyone close to me again was mortifying, and it was hard to imagine surviving that kind of pain a third time. That's when Rob came back. At first, I would catch a shape just out of the corner of my eyes when I looked in the mirror. I accepted it as exhaustion and was more preoccupied with marveling at how shitty I was starting to look from neglecting my needs. It kept happening, though. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him sitting down in one of my chairs, and he'd be gone by the time I'd look back. I'd wake up to the sound of the TV on in the living room, usually on some sports channel. No matter what I did, though, I could never catch a full look at him. I started to assume I had finally snapped and completely lost it. I was second-guessing what was real and what was fake at every turn, and the feeling made me isolate myself even more. I started to think I was a potential threat to society, and that I'd be better off either not associating with it or dead. In my lowest moment, that's when I heard his voice again for the first time. It was distant and faint, though I could swear he said, "Pick yourself up, champ." I bawled on the floor when I heard it. It was a cocktail of wonderful, horrible emotions. It was a familiar voice, reassuring me. It was like hearing an old voicemail from a long-lost friend. At the same time, it was hard to forget what had happened all those years ago, and why I was scared of him in the first place. Not to mention that hearing voices in my head didn't feel like a great sign. But at least I didn't feel quite as alone. It was sort of a wake-up call. I tried putting myself back together. I started sleeping on a more regular schedule and made sure to eat at least 3 times a day. I tried reaching out to old friends and socializing more. I had grown agoraphobic over the months I had spent locked away inside, so I did my best to get outside for as long as I could manage each day. I've gotten a lot better. I feel healthier than I ever have, and I'd like to say I'm okay again. I've recovered, at least. Only, I thought that would make Rob fade away, back into the recesses of my mind. He hasn't. I still see him, whether out of the corners of my eye, in old photos, or even in the distance outside my house. I still see him. Sometimes, at night, I hear his voice muffled outside my window. I try to pick it up on my phone, and the nights I leave it recording are the nights he doesn't talk. That's not the only thing bothering me, though. The same time Rob started appearing again, John's case was reopened for investigation. The playground was torn down decades ago. However, they've recently been clearing the forest behind my old house as well. While they were cutting down trees, part of a tree trunk collapsed when it struck the ground. Inside the debris, they found remains of a child's skeleton. The bones matched some of John's old x-rays. No one knows how they got in there, as the portion the bones were in was toward the very top of the tree. A few feet below it, words carved into the tree read, "Had to go." They've started finding carvings like this all over the forest, too. I'm not sure what idea scares me more, Rob being a part of my imagination, or Rob being real. All I know is that I keep seeing him more and more, and it feels like he's angry at me. I don't know what to do, and I'm too scared to look at him anymore. Please, help me. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.